So, two final things I wanted to talk to you about. First one, I know you are hesitant to discuss it, but I need to know your thoughts on this. The whole issue of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, the fact that, from what I understand, please clarify if I'm incorrect on this, but they've said they are no longer going to extend their franchising license to, was it Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, or was it all of Israel? And can you just clarify what it is that happened, and what is your message to Ben and Jerry's?
Okay, so first of all, why I was hesitant is because I think a place for Israelis or people who are deeply connected to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to express their political perspective about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and settlements through boycott. And I think there are legitimate cases for that where you're not singling out Israel, it's your cause, and therefore that is a legitimate way in which you're expressing yourself. But that's not what happened here. Okay, so I wanted to put that aside, as that can be legitimate depending on who you are. If you're just a random person in the world who comes out and says, I'm going to boycott what I believe to be Israeli or Palestinian occupied territory, or things coming out of that territory, then my question to you would be, okay, well, why are you just choosing this conflict and not all the other places where there are disputed territories or occupied territories in the world, right? Like that's one of the larger issues, is if you're singling out Israel, the question is why? And usually that's where we get back to anti-Semitism. Now, what happened with Ben and Jerry's? So you have a larger company, Unilever, and then you've got Ben and Jerry's, which is attached to that company. And then you have the small Ben and Jerry's board that functions out of Burlington, Vermont, where the primary Ben and Jerry's factory is. And they still have a say in kind of the external image of Ben and Jerry's. And so this board decided to essentially demand of the Ben and Jerry's distributor in Israel to stop distributing Ben and Jerry's ice cream in the West Bank and even in the old city of Jerusalem, seeing Jerusalem as part of this area that they've dubbed occupied territory, which is a whole conversation in and of itself on if it's occupied versus disputed. There is a legitimate legal debate to have for both of these perspectives. We'll put that aside. And so what has happened is the manufacturer here in Israel refused. He said, I can't do that. I can't stop distributing in these territories. And what that prompted was him losing his license. Wow. That then we now understand is going to expire in the end of 2022. What that could mean is that the 160 Israelis, both Arabs and Jews, who work at the Ben and Jerry's factory are at risk of losing their jobs once that licensing expires. What is the ultimate problem with this, right? Based on everything that I just said, that means that we're not just boycotting Israeli settlements in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, right? Or the occupied territory, so-called occupied territory. That means that essentially, because of this non-compliance, they're going to shut down Ben and Jerry's in Israel, which means you're ultimately boycotting Israel. And this is now, then the larger question is why? Why did this happen? And it happened because the BDS movement has put immense pressure on these companies to boycott Israel. But let's understand why, right? This isn't because they want to see a policy change in the West Bank. The BDS movement has continuously acknowledged outwardly that they do not want to see Israel exist. The founder of the BDS movement, Omar Barghouti, has said clearly that if all of their goals were to be fulfilled, that there would not be an Israel next to a Palestine, meaning a two-state solution, but there would be a Palestine next to a Palestine, meaning no Israel. You can look up videos of Omar Barghouti, who very clearly states that he is completely opposed to the existence of a Jewish state. And so the end goal of the BDS movement is not to change Israeli policy, it's to eliminate the existence of the state of Israel. And unfortunately, what Ben and Jerry's has done is they've caved to a very anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic movement And what they're ultimately doing is promoting a movement that is not about peaceful reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, that does not promote dialogue, that does not promote peaceful conversations between Israelis and Palestinians, or policies that would push us towards peace. What they support is an end goal that would mean no Israel will exist. And so unfortunately, even though the intentions of some of these people, the board members, Ben and Jerry themselves, who put out this op-ed in the New York Times, who say, well, we're against settlements, and so that's why we support this. But that's not what's happened here. Ultimately, as a result of this, it looks like the Israeli factory itself is going to be shut down, which means you've now extended your boycott to Israel, the country itself. And you've, again, caved to a movement that is not about policy change, but is about Israel not existing anymore. And so it's not just, this isn't just about ice cream, right? This is about the promotion of a movement who wants to see an end to Israel. And that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. That's not a way that we're going to get to justice for the Palestinians, as they would say, or peace for Israeli and for the Israelis and the Palestinians. So I'm against this. Any credence that's given to the BDS movement is bad, because all it does is promote negativity. It promotes divisiveness, more polarization, and ultimately an end goal that would see my country not existing anymore.
Is there any chance that this decision by Ben and Jerry's could be reversed and this whole thing could just, I mean, I'm sure it's possible, right?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. When they see the implications of it, right? When they see that what it ultimately ends up happening is that they've boycotted Israel, maybe. And we're also seeing that Unilever, the larger company, is getting backlash, not just is getting backlash legally, because in the United States, there are many states, over half of the states in America have passed anti-BDS legislation. Understanding that BDS is anti-Semitic, is pushing for the end to Israel, that Israel is not a country that's worthy of boycotts. Israel is a country that doesn't need to be pressured to come to the negotiating table and work with the Palestinians to end our presence in the West Bank or anything else. Israel has been ready and willing to come to the negotiating table whenever that was an option. And so this is just not a target for BDS. So they've passed all this anti-BDS legislation, which now Unilever is going to have issues with in the states that they work in. So we are seeing a pushback that could ultimately change this decision in the long run. We'll see.
Is there anything we can do on the ground to help apply pressure?
I think everything that I just said, right? It's to apply pressure. Yeah. I mean, you could send your letters, you can express how you feel about this to the company itself and why this is not a good decision. And I think the biggest thing is also raise awareness, right? I mean, that's my whole thing, right? It's all about what we can always do is raise awareness. We can educate people about what the BDS movement really stands for and why caving to the BDS movement, even if, again, you might support boycotts against settlements, but not against Israel, ultimately by playing into the movement, you are playing into a movement that is vile and anti-Semitic and wants to see the end of the Jewish state altogether. And so that's, I think, where we can play a role, is really educating people on what this movement really stands for, because they try to present themselves as, you know, pro-peace and pro-human rights and lovey-dovey, when no, they're anti-dialogue, they're anti-normalization, and their end goal is that a Jewish state won't exist. They're adamantly opposed to Zionism in and of itself. And so that's where we can play a role. Just educate people and educate yourself on the issue.
Right.